Hello, BookTube. All right, we're back for more 7.4K Q&A questions. And we are starting here with Keenan Hadzik. I have a weird question. I'm sure you won't be the only one. What do you think of dog neutering and people who neuter their dogs? Should it be done? No. No, it shouldn't be done. No, it shouldn't be done. A dog, by definition, cannot give permission for an operation. So, especially an operation like this. Should it be done if we're talking a huge semi-feral population of dogs at the outskirts of a large city that is growing and growing and growing, and the dogs are diseased and there's no food and their sheer numbers are causing them to be shot or poisoned? Okay, maybe then a program where veterinarians go out in vans, capture these dogs and neuter them so that they stop reproducing. Maybe then. But if you get a dog as a pet, and you're going to neuter the dog, then that is your admission that you are going to allow that dog to be one of those semi-feral dogs. And therefore you can't govern whether or not the dog is going to irresponsibly reproduce. If that's your mind frame for your dog, that, well, I've got Fido here, but I'm going to let him out into the backyard and run all around the neighborhood, run up the mountain and back, but he'll come home once in a while for food and to pet. So since he's going to do that, I should probably have him neutered, since I won't be able to account for his whereabouts all the time. Well, if you think that way, then I'd like to see you line up your 10-year-olds for neutering as well, because the same thing is true. No. If we're talking neutering as a science project, a project to go out and keep feral dog numbers down, then maybe. If we're talking something that an owner does, it horrifies me. It absolutely horrifies me. It's the standard line. In American veterinary practice anyway, it's the standard line. You get a new puppy, let's say from a breeder, you absolutely should not do that. You absolutely should not do that. If you want a puppy, go to the pound. Tell the people at the pound, get to know them, talk to them, don't just come in and bark orders. Get to know them, talk to them, and then tell them what you're looking for. I want to adopt a dog from the pound. I'm kind of sort of looking for a purebred puppy. Guarantee you they will get purebred puppies. Do that. But if you get, and keep in mind, I'm not advocating that. If you're in the market for a dog, go to your local pound and adopt the oldest dog there. That's my advice for what you should do. But most people want puppies, so if you go and get a puppy, in America anyway, you bring that puppy to the vet for a checkup and to open a file on that dog. One of the first things that your veterinarian will say is, well, we should make an appointment for neutering or spaying. And I understand why they're doing it, because they don't want to see any unwanted dogs end up in shelters or euthanized. I understand why they're doing it. But it is not necessary. If you are a responsible owner, it is not necessary for you to neuter or spay your dog. It just is not necessary to do. I have my issues with it. Let's just put it that way. Once upon a time I brought a beagle into the vet, and he of course had not been neutered, and he was like 2 years old. Perfectly healthy dog, lived to be 16, and I brought him in when he was 2, and he was up on the table with the vet, and the vet was just, being their usual pompous self, explaining to me, this animal is called a dog. And I'm standing there just biting my tongue, because I know a whole lot more about the insides, outsides, behavior, and history of this animal than you ever will, no matter how many veterinary schools you went to. I know the names of muscle groups, nerve fibers, everything that you don't know, that you've long since forgotten. And here you are lecturing me because you get a chance to do that. But in the midst of all of that pomposity, at one point he reached around, cupped my boy's balls in his hand, and said, these will have to come off. And I said, well, why is that? And I was still trying to control myself. I said, why is that? And he said, well, a whole bunch of health reasons. I mean, you leave them on, you've got obviously a much greater increased chance of testicular cancer. And I wanted so bad to say, okay, that's your line of reasoning. So when did you have yours lopped off? Of course, if you have them, you have a greater chance of them getting cancer. But that... I stress again, that dog lived to be a hale and healthy 16 years old without being maimed on a veterinarian's assumption that I am a bad owner. That's where that comes from. It comes from the assumption that your dog is not going to be accountable to you for large stretches of time and could be out there in the fields mating with everything that moves. which is an irresponsible owner. And it, I guess, is a kind of a vet's job, especially in an urban district, to assume that every owner is irresponsible. But anyway, didn't you get an airflow? Let's move on. Golden Books TAS says, I know you don't like favorite questions. Well, it's not so much that I don't like favorite questions, but the kinds of questions that I get sometimes, not most of the time not, but sometimes you're in a car accident and you leave at a quadriplegic, you can't move your arms and legs, you can't move at all, and you're strapped to a hospital bed, and there's an iPad directly over your face, and you have to pick one of these 3 authors, and if you don't pick the right one, your absolute favorite, the iPad snaps from its holding on the ceiling, falls down, and cuts you in the throat. Which do you pick? That kind of stuff, those kind of duress scenarios don't do anybody any good. They're not a reflection of anything that I think. They're not anything you can take to the bank. They're not considered questions. But what was your considered question? May I ask what your favorite questions are? Oh, well, I don't have favorite questions. Just the ones that are ridiculously combative. You know, it's a burning house. You've only got one thing you can save. Which thing is it? Tell me which thing it is. Like, that's gonna. Anyway, we haven't hit one of those yet. So, Peter Prablo asks, how do you not like Flaubert? I never said I don't like Flaubert. I never said that. I don't love him in the way that his fans do, but I never said that I don't like him. Peter Willis asks, are there 2 or 3 lost books you would most like to see recovered? My first choice would be Byron's lost memoir, the memoir. Byron wrote a memoir that was burned by his publisher in a ceremony in his office. I agree. Well, that would be high on my list as well. Also, of course, the lost books of Tacitus and Livy. I would love to have those. The list is enormous. We went through a lot of them in our Daily Penguin. We went through a lot of authors who survive only by a fraction. And even the fraction sometimes is an echo of an echo. So, yeah, there's a lot of lost stuff I'd like back. Jack Tar says, number 1, being as I am a 20-something young man, I've often wondered, why is my age group so prone to mawkish nostalgia? Okay, let's keep in mind, it's not the 20-something women who are prone to mawkish nostalgia. It's 20-something men. And I believe that it is directly connected to the megastar, superstar status of charlatans like Jordan Peterson, who tap into the fact that 20-something men now, 20-something men in a broad bracket going back to 2010 or thereabouts, even the whole of the 21st century, are famously aimless. They famously don't know what they want to do. They have no guidance. They have no adult male who's willing to tell them what to do, who they can also respect. They might have authority figures who tell them what to do, but the authority figures are sometimes brusque or stupid. And they don't have an adult man who is taking a pointed and considered interest in them without requiring that they become carbon copies. They don't have that. They don't have mentors, in other words. And they'll grab to the closest thing they can get, someone like Jordan Peterson. They'll grab to the closest thing they can get because they feel aimless. They don't know what to do with their dreams, with their ambitions. They don't know what's right and wrong in terms of social norms. And they have almost no guidance. Almost none whatsoever. I don't know about young women that age, but I have a suspicion that young women that age have the guidance of the women in their lives who are much easier, much more comfortable at giving that guidance. Whereas men, it's always a problem. And if you are confused and aimless in your present life, of course you will be nostalgic. That's where nostalgia comes from, is preferring the past to the present. That's why it's such a weak emotion. It ought to be a foremost indicator to you that you're doing your present wrong, if that's the case. I use myself as an example. Those of you who've been with this channel for a very long time may remember I had 2 dogs when I started this channel. I had a pointer and I had a basset hound. And some of you will know, and certainly all of you who know me in real life will know, that basset hound was my whole life. I loved my pointer. I loved Malin. But Lucy was my whole life. She was one of those kinds of dogs. One of those kinds of people where it's not just I love you, it's I can't live without you. Even though she was insane and didn't like me at all. That was a very strong emotion. And she died, and I got another dog. And you all know that I deeply adore my little dog now. That's not a shallowness of emotion on my part. That's a rejection of nostalgia. And you should reject it too. It's a weak, time-wasting emotion. If you're feeling a marked preference for the past over the present, then you need to address the present. And that is one of the many things that a male mentor, would say to you if you had one. If these aimless 20-something men had such a person, they would be getting this kind of advice. I feel sorry for those young men. We're not, no one's meeting anybody because of a pandemic, but feel free to email me. Feel free to email me. We can also Voxer. I'm at your disposal if you want a little help along those lines. It's a serious question. Question number 2, how do you reinforce books? Is it as simple as covering it with packing tape? Well, in my case it is, but that makes certain more refined souls wince. You can go online and buy, for instance, acetate coverings for books that don't require you to stick anything to a dust jacket. It's library style clear plastic coverings for books. You can go and buy those in bulk. You can also buy large sheets of clear plastic and fold them to the size of the book you want, origami style, which also doesn't require you to stick anything to the surface of the book. I do that with my books, where I will reinforce the book with clear plastic packing tape. You can see the seams there where the strips of tape are. I do that because I'm not planning on getting rid of the books I do that to. I'm planning on keeping them. They're my books. And this, for me, works really well. It means you don't have to worry about the dust jacket anymore. And then I anchor the covered dust jacket to the book so that I don't have to worry about it popping off anymore. So that I have a completely durable, water-resistant covering for this book and don't have to think about it anymore. And that works for me. I'm not advocating it for anybody else. There are a lot more gentle ways to reinforce a book than that. That works for me. Either I will do that in one of two cases. Either I do that with a book that I am going to keep for the rest of my life, or I do that with a book that is too flimsy to read, but that I'm not going to keep afterwards. That's going to fall apart even with reinforcing, so that I'm just going to throw it away. But I want to be able to read it without it coming apart in my hands. So I will do that in that case too. If I find a ratty mass market paperback of something that I definitely want to read, then I will read it. I'll reinforce it a little and read it, and then get rid of it. Question number 3, thoughts on The Eye of Argon by James Tace, and when is the read-along? Oh my God, Jack Tar, you are a troublemaker. I don't know how many of you know The Eye of Argon. There will never be a read-along of this, which is widely regarded as one of the worst books ever written. We will certainly not be doing a read-along of The Eye of Argon. Naturally, what do I think about it? You can guess what I think about it, because I'm a contrarian. I went into it thinking, all right, well, I'm going to find the worth in this book. This book that is legendary for how terrible it is. I'm going to find the worth in it. No, that's not possible. There isn't any worth in it. Let's see here. Colin, how are we doing for time? Okay, Colin Outdoors says, what are your thoughts on Paul Thoreau? I think he's fantastic. Really like him. Can we have an Everyman's Library shelf tour? We're doing a penguin a day. That's not enough. We're doing a penguin a day for the rest of the year. Believe me, I've been tempted. Oh my, I've been tempted. Because Jason Harrigan over at Byways in Brooklyn just started the mother of all library shelf tours. His own collection in his house there in Ireland. And oh my God, it has me yearning to... For a minute, I thought, do you dare to do a shelf tour again in 2020 when you just did one in 2019? But no, my Daily Penguin is enough. Peter Gardner says, what are your thoughts on the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Steve Erickson? I like it. I like it a lot. I think it's overdone, of course, as is my thought with many of these ongoing book series. I don't care how many times he gets up on his hind legs at a convention and says, look, this was all carefully planned to be 8 million pages long. No, a trilogy is just fine. And you know, when somebody says that to me, I say, all right, well, you're the author. If you think you can sell that many books, that's fine. Great. If the author goes a little further and comes directly to me and says it cannot be any shorter, well, Seymour, you don't want to tell me that. And the Malazan Book of the Fallen is a perfect example. Oh my God. You tell me I'm writing this at the length that I envision it, fine. Great. I'm on board, especially if you're as good a writer as he is. You tell me this cannot be shortened? It can most certainly be shortened, and so can the Wheel of Time and a bunch of these other open-ended things. Flora Bah Humbug says, given your tendency towards beagles. Yes, for those of you who are new to the channel, which is the whole point of this Q&A, is to celebrate that there are new people on this channel. The thing that some of my older subscribers will, or people who've been through 3,000 videos, will be referring to might not be familiar to you, especially since I'm assuming that no one who finds my channel goes back and looks at those 3,000 videos. That's weeks of viewing. What Flora is referring to here is that for most of my life, I had beagles. 1 beagle, 2 beagles, 3 beagles, sometimes 8 beagles, sometimes a big crowd of beagles, those triangular heads, those wavering white flags of tails stuck up in the air. Those are the sigils of my existence for a long, long time, longer than most of you have been alive, longer than most of your parents have been alive. They were mine. They were mine. They were my people. To the point where in the early years of Facebook, friends who hadn't met me in a long time would say, well, I need to catch up with you. The only things I know about you are the things I know won't change. You'll be working in a bookstore and you'll have beagles. And in recent years, I've had to tell people who found me, no, I'm not working in a bookstore and I don't have beagles. I haven't had beagles in a long time. Anyway, given your tendency towards beagles, how did your lovely basset hound, Hippo, enter your life? I found her in traffic. I was walking a bunch of beagles, and I found her in traffic. She was a little puppy, 6-month-old puppy, and she was running up to cars in traffic to greet them and maybe mate with them. She was running up to strangers, and she had, I thought, in a situation like that where she was obviously in danger. I mean, it was 4 o'clock rush hour traffic outside of a subway stop. And in a situation like that, you can't say the next person will do the right thing. You have to do the right thing yourself, no matter what your plans are. So I squatted down and I coaxed her. She was a little cowardly, and my dogs were baying their heads off at her. So she was curious, though, as to who this was and these dogs. She wanted to run up to us as well. I was coaxing her closer and closer. I thought, if you can just get you close enough to grab you, then you won't be running around anymore. I'll have you. And she eventually did. She got close enough so I could grab her. And I was holding on to her. My dogs only bayed. They weren't aggressive at all. So they were getting to know her. And I didn't have a cell phone at the time. I asked a passerby if I could use their cell phone to call my apartment, which thankfully was nearby. It wasn't Hyde Cottage. And thankfully there was someone there, and I was able to direct them. I was able to say, there's a spare leash and collar by the door. Could you get it and come to me? I'm just a minute away from the front door. If there had been no passerby, if I hadn't remembered the number to the apartment, if no one had been home, if I had been much further along on the walk, I don't know what I would have done. But instead they came, they brought a leash. I put a leash on the little basset hound puppy, and we all walked, all of us together, a big crowd of dogs by then. And I was thinking the whole time, well, this is a purebred basset hound puppy, so she'll have a microchip, and there'll be flyers and notices all over the place for somebody losing her. But I checked. I checked for a week solid with every veterinarian, with the police. My vet scanned the microchip in her leg, but all of the information was defunct. So I just kept her. I had wondered for years what it'd be like if I ever found a dog in traffic, and I finally did. And once I got to know Lucy, eventually a friend of mine named her Lucy, and once I got to know her, she was violently insane, just Mary Todd Lincoln insane. She heard voices and farted all the time and was really, really stupid. And once I realized all that, I realized why the information on her microchip was outdated, because the minute she got out of somebody's yard, they packed up and left town to make sure she couldn't find them. And Malin came to me because she made her original family allergic, badly, badly allergic. And they contacted me, and it was a case of, do you still do this thing with dogs? Will you still help out with a dog? And I will. If possible, I will. So I took her in. And little did I guess that soon my beagles would be gone, and suddenly I would have no beagles. I would have a basset hound and a pointer. Now, most people don't know dogs. Take a look at a basset hound and think that's a beagle, or think they're basically the same thing. So for a long time, not everybody noticed. Now everybody notices, because I have a little schnauzer and only one dog, and those are both strange. So let's see here. Kirk says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on hard-boiled fiction, especially Jim Thompson, Dave Goodis, Maurice MacDonald, and of course Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and James M. Cain. Are there lesser-known hard-boiled crime writers you'd recommend? I recommend all the ones that you name here. They're not lesser known, but then again, you haven't read every word by every one of them. So and lesser known is As far as I'm concerned, there are no hidden gems. These are the best of the best. So best to read them, and they are terrific. They are really good. Let's see, how are we doing for time? Okay, we're fine. Thrifty Reader has a series of questions. Number one, what are your thoughts on keeping a commonplace book? I think it's a great idea. Great idea. It would the people that I've known who've kept commonplace books, the number one mistake they tend to make is not to jot down the provenance, just to jot down the quotes. That's a bad idea. You're always going to want to know the provenance. In fact, the older you get, the more you're going to want to know the provenance, over the quote. So if you're keeping a commonplace book or a commonplace file on your computer and you jot down a quote, do yourself a favor and add a little paragraph. Read it in such and such a book at such and such a time in such and such a place. Maybe at such and such an age, depending on how long you plan on keeping the commonplace book. But they're wonderful. They're wonderful to read and they're wonderful to keep. They really do help. Question number 2, have you ever taken part in a talent show? No. Question number 3, how do you choose your pet's names? It's a wide variety of ways. Sometimes I'll wait for a certain sound or a certain combination of sounds. Sometimes I know it right away. Sometimes I'll leave it up to a friend. Sometimes it'll be pure association. My pointer, Malin Moore, the pointer that I just mentioned, when I saw her, she looked exactly like a stray dog that I once knew at Malin Head in Ireland, the north of Ireland. Exactly like that. I thought, well, that's Malin Moore is a good name for a dog, so I gave her that. Whereas Lucy was named by someone else. At the time that I got Lucy, I was working. I had a retail job. I had to leave, even though she was a little puppy and was just new to her surroundings. So I had a friend come over and stay with her when she didn't have a name. And when I got back that evening, I found them sound asleep on the bed together. My other dogs were happy to see me, but the two of them were sound asleep on the bed. And as I was asking how did things go, in the course of that conversation, he just happened to mention, I've been calling her Lucy all day. I thought, okay, well, fine. She hasn't been misbehaved for me, so I'll take it. And then his last question, Thrifty Reader's last question is, have you ever visited the Shakespeare and Company bookstore? Is the Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Australia? No. Is it in New Guinea? No. Is it the most famous bookstore anywhere in the world? Yes. What do you think the answer is? Let's just move on. I'm disgusted with all of you. Hannah's Books, another well-known troublemaker. Would you consider committing again to This Week in BookTube? I used to have a feature on this channel, what she's referring to, a regular feature called Last Week in BookTube, where I would just look back on my last week of BookTube viewing and just talk about the various channels and events and whatnot. I really should do that, especially since, thanks to a couple of channels, especially the Saturday Hodgepodge over at Brian Bookish's channel, these kinds of miscellaneous catch-all videos are all the rage on BookTube. So I should do that, because I was there first with Last Week in BookTube. I should commit to that, absolutely. I just have to hope that it wouldn't be just a long session of me ranting about how many ways that Brian at Bookish is wrong about everything. But I'm sure I can figure out a way. I should try that. I should do that. I should make it a Monday thing. Let's see here. Arm in Dade asks, I've heard you state many times that you began reading late in life, but I don't believe you have ever stated the exact age. I'm not sure of the exact age. Not late in life, but later in life than the rest of you. The rest of you started as children. I didn't start as a child. I ask out of the hope that I may have a chance of obtaining your literary knowledge. Well, literary knowledge isn't a question of how early you start reading. It's a question of what you do with it. How much of it do you remember? How engaged with it are you? But I don't know the exact age. But it wasn't a child. I'm green with envy when I hear all of you talk about how the first thing you remember is reading. When I hear you talk about how your parents read to you and you read with them, and books were an intricate part of your life when you were in grade school and all that. That is just amazing. PHXSNS asks, one of my favorite reading feelings is returning to a book I had trouble comprehending at a younger age, only to find that it now reads much easier. I struggled with Shakespeare in high school, but not at all 10 years later. Have you experienced this? Perhaps not, given how late you came to reading, and if so, with which book? I've experienced it all the time. I experienced it with Shakespeare. Yeah, Yeah, all the time. I'll go back to an author after a span of decades and think, wow, there's a lot more here than I thought. Yeah, it happens a lot. Uh, Question number 2, thoughts on James McBride, especially The Good Lord Bird. I like him. I read Deacon King Kong just recently. I read The Good Lord Bird. I like them. I think he's good. And question number 3, do you particularly enjoy reading film criticism? Well, what does that mean? I particularly enjoy reading good film criticism. If it's good, then I like it. Yeah, as a thing, as a category, I don't care about categories at all. Any kind of category. I care about the good stuff. I could read Pauline Kael till the cows come home. She's gone now. Once upon a time, Premiere Magazine. I don't know if Premiere Magazine's made anymore. Once upon a time, they had a wonderful movie review column in the back by Libby Waxman-Gelmer. It was a fictional creation, a fictional persona of the writer Paul Rudnick. I think it was Paul Rudnick. And Libby Waxman-Gelmer's column was called If You Ask Me. And it was film criticism, but it was so good. It was just so good. And a lot of those were collected into a book called If You Ask Me, which I wish I had. If you see it, you should grab it because you're going to love it. And also David Thompson. Anything he writes on film criticism is just great. But yeah, no, I don't. I mean, the really good stuff I really like. I don't have any Pauline Kael at the moment, and that's bad. I lost it at the movies, 5001 Nights at the movies. I ought to have those. Those are classics, and I don't have them at the moment. How are we doing? All right, let's do one more. Chapter 2 says, what are some essential epic fantasy series that should be read more? Perhaps some that have fallen into obscurity, forgotten, or overlooked. Well, I've mentioned a few of them on this channel over the time. Lord Dunsany. Lord Dunsany is one of the formative people who comes before Tolkien, and who Tolkien knew very well. Evangeline Walton, her Mabinogion quartet is fantastic. Even Fritz Leiber is largely forgotten. His Lankmar books, but there are a whole bunch of fantasy authors. Like for instance, I know a lot of fantasy fans will turn up their nose at Robert E. Howard, but you shouldn't. You shouldn't do it. You should read a lot of his stuff. And also asks, let's see here, what do you think of Eric T. Knight and his Chaos Cycle epic fantasy ebooks? I haven't read them. I've heard a lot about this series. Is it really good? Should I read it? I haven't read them. And finally, could you give us your opinion on all of the Dune adaptations? David Lynch's Dune is terrible, just awful, just egregiously horrible in every single moment. The sci-fi miniseries, both Dune and Children of Dune, are really, really good. I really enjoy. They really stand up. And the question also extends to the upcoming film version and whether or not I think it will be any good. I think it will stink. I think it's going to stink because it's being reworked for a number of reasons. Number one, it's being reworked for woke points, and that betrays an essential cavalier nature towards the source material, towards this great novel. Now, that can be done in the sense of, not so much in the assaulting sense of woke points, but in the sense of balancing things just a little for the demographic of your cast and your audience. Like, for instance, in Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, where you could, even as a non-woke reader, you could look at Lord of the Rings and say, yes, there's Galadriel, and yes, there's Éowyn, but there isn't really much in the way of female characters in this book. It's mostly a boy's story. Fellowship is all men. Most of the adventures are involving men. All the bad guys are men. Maybe, if you're Peter Jackson, you're thinking, I'm going to adapt this, maybe I make a couple more prominent women. And so instead of Glorfindel in Fellowship of the Ring, we get Arwen. And she has a little more prominent a role. No violence there, as far as I'm concerned. No violence there, because Glorfindel's not going to reappear in the books, and Arwen is. So, no violence there. But when you look, it is not possible for you to take a 30,000-foot look at Dune and say women are underrepresented in the book. There's no way to do that. None. At all. There's no way to do that. And yet, the director of this forthcoming Dune movie did that, which tells me that he's an idiot, and that his woke casting will make for an adaptation of something that isn't Dune. And that's one reason. One reason is that the auteur, who is the director, seems to be going for woke points. And that's always bad. That is always bad. When you do that, inorganically. When you do that mechanically, just to please a certain faction of an audience who will otherwise drag you on Twitter, but who is not under any circumstances going to see the movie anyway, no matter what you do. When you do that, you always hurt yourself and nothing else. You don't help anything when you do that artificially. That's one reason. And the other reason is the star of the show, Timothy Chalamet, who is a hair-flouncing showboat with very little in the way of acting talent, who I am sure wanted the whole production to revolve around him. And granted, he's playing Paul Atreides, and the book does revolve around Paul Atreides, but, well, we shall see. we shall see. I'll be watching. When it comes out, I will be watching it, and we will see. All right, so we're going to wrap this up. I'm going to go on to segment number 3.